Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's so great to see all of you tonight. My name is Andrea Pirro, and I'm the director of the Visiting Artists Program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. It's my pleasure to welcome you to SAIC's Distinguished Alumni Lecture Series featuring artist Dred Scott. We are so thrilled to welcome Dred back to SAIC, and I would like to thank him for taking the time to be here with us tonight to share his important and powerful work. In just a moment, you will hear remarks from SAIC's Provost and Senior Vice President of Academic Affairs, Martin Berger, followed by an introduction of Dred Scott by Presidential Professor Jefferson Pinder. For those of you that might be joining us for the first time, SAIC's Visiting Artists Program hosts a variety of public talks by internationally recognized artists, designers, and scholars to expand our thinking about contemporary art and culture. In addition to public programs, our guests engage with SAIC students through studio visits, discussions, and workshops, providing unique and inspiring experiences for our students. I have just a few things to note before we get started. If you could please kindly silence your cell phones at this time, and note that video recording of the lecture is not permitted. At the end of Dred's presentation, we will have time to take 3 or 4 questions from the audience before the program concludes by 7:30. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and our staff will bring a microphone to you. We ask that if you are posing a question, if you could please keep it concise so we can get to as many questions as time allows. For those of you that are just coming in, we do have quite a few seats right in the front, on your right, and also in the center section. We also have a few seats open towards the front here on the left side as well. I would now like to welcome to the podium Martin Berger, SAIC Provost and Senior Vice President of Academic Affairs. In addition, just one second. In addition to his leadership role at SAIC, Martin is a scholar with expertise in 19th and 20th century US art and culture, with a particular focus on representation, gender, and race. He is the author of 3 books, and his latest book, titled Inventing Stereotype, Race, Representation, and Interwar America, will be published next year by the University of Chicago Press. Please welcome Martin Berger.
Thanks, everybody, and welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Visiting Artists Program's Distinguished Alumni Lecture by Dred Scott. The Distinguished Alumni Lectures have been an annual highlight of the Visiting Artists Program since 2006. They have featured such internationally known alums as Sanford Biggers, Jeff Koons, William Cordova, Nugent Smith, Jeffrey Gibson, Jenny Sorkin, Sonia Clark, Diane Simpson, and Jacob Hashimoto, among many others. The Visiting Artists Program has a much longer history, dating to 1868, just 3 years after the founding of SAIC. Since 1977, the lectures have been recorded, preserved, and made accessible to the SAIC community. To date, VAP has recorded over 1,000 international artists, designers, and scholars representing more than 70 countries, who presented a diverse mix of lectures, screenings, conversations, and readings. This evening's distinguished alumni speaker will be introduced by one of SAIC's most accomplished faculty members, Presidential Professor Jefferson Pinder. I can't imagine a more appropriate person to introduce Scott and his art. For nearly a quarter century, Pinder has employed neon, found objects, video, photography, and performance to interrogate Black identity and to push audiences to see the contradictions, power, horror, and malleability of race in America. While it's not uncommon today to encounter artworks that simply visualize the racial insights developed by scholars of race studies, sociology, or history, Pinder and Scott's work share the admirable capacity to make use of visual arts to create new knowledge of race. In other words, their artworks actively intervene in scholarly debates over race in America. Over the course of their distinguished careers, they have each deployed physicality and affect in their artworks in ways that have thrown artists and scholars off balance and compelled us to rethink the more clinical work of those academics whose insights are conveyed primarily through the written word. Pinder and Scott make us feel, both past and present, so forcing us into a personal relationship with their subjects, which has encouraged us to reconsider both race and our national values. Please join me in welcoming to the podium my esteemed colleague at SAIC, Presidential Professor Jefferson Pinder.
Wow, thank you. It's starting to feel a little Southern in here. It's like one introduction after the other. It's like an HBCU. It's my honor to introduce Dred Scott to you all today. Dred is a bold and cutting-edge artist who encourages viewers to re-examine oppressive political structures, economic foundations, social relations, and governing ideas of America. For years, he's been a colleague, and he's been a huge inspiration for me in my practice personally. Dred is an interdisciplinary artist through and through, and that should be no surprise. He went to school here. His work, photography, painting, printmaking, and many other, but I can say that one of his weapons of choice is performance art. I would make an argument that that's a fractal of his whole artistic practice. And what's unique to mention is that his work is sophisticated in its defiance. As famed performance curator Rosalie Goldberg has emphasized for years, performance art is so tricky because it falls between the cracks. It defies definition. It's not theater, it's not dance, it's not sport, but it may incorporate many of these elements of these disciplines. But perhaps it's most powerful when it escapes all definition, when performance art proudly defies and says, I am because I am. And it says that I can define myself by what I'm not. What I admire about Dred is he is a hard target. He can't easily be defined. He is easily on the move, exploring new ideas and mediums. Dred can't easily be bought or commodified. He's disruptive by challenging our way of being, our comfort, eloquently and beautifully combining art making with activism. Perhaps one of the most difficult things that Dred accomplishes really well. He creates his own processes, his systems. His work is immediate and has a directness of a blade. And in the context of SAIC, the best conceptual art school in the country, in the world, we have to admit at times we talk a lot. We theorize, and often we create, and our very best we make. But other times we have brilliant conversations about what we think about the world, how we want the world to change. But I think what's really special, and we saw this last semester, that a few are called to do the dirty work. A few are actually involved in changing policies, laws, and the way people think. It's a unique situation in which we can have the possibility to alter the fiber of our society. Dred has done this from the onset of his career, and he set the high mark of accomplishing this repeatedly. When he was a student here, he created work that changed American law at the highest level. At the School of the Art Institute's undergraduate thesis exhibition of 1989, Dred Scott laid the American flag on the floor of the gallery, creating a setting in which spectator was presented a choice of stepping onto the flag to access the rest of the gallery, an installation which consisted of a photo montage pictures of South Korean students burning U.S. flags, along with coffins wrapped in the U.S. flag. Underneath, prints of an empty note and an empty notebook that encouraged the audience to respond to the title of the work that asked the question, what is the proper way to display the U.S. flag? So newly elected George H.W. Bush declared it disgraceful because of its transgressive use of the American flag. And the United States Senate denounced the installation along with the institution that held it. So the same year, Scott and other protesters were arrested for burning the American flag on the steps of the US Capitol, defying the Flag Protection Act of 1989, and this led to a year-long sophisticated Supreme Court case that Dred will talk about tonight. But in this way, Scott's body of work aims to rewrite the foundations of a system rooted in social injustice by shedding light on the current but archaic mechanisms of oppression. Since then, he has had a continued and meteoric rise to fame in the art world. He's been featured in numerous solo and group exhibitions nationally and internationally. In 2008, he was featured at MoMA PS1. In 2018, Dred received the United States Artist Fellowship. In 2021, Guggenheim Fellowship. The 2021 Freeze Impact Prize for his community-based project Wanted, denouncing the criminalization of Black and Latinx youth in the United States, along with notable faculty member Maria Gaspar. He was also a Rome Prize winner in 23-24, and his installation performance called The All African People Consulate was showcased at the Venice Biennial as collateral event of the 60th International Art Exhibition. Okay. It is my wonderful and sincere privilege to introduce to you an artist that I respect so much. If you'd be so kind to greet Dred with a thunderous homecoming, a round of applause that he will not soon forget. Help us make this moment. SAIC, this is Dred Scott.
All right, thank you. It is really great to be here, and thank you for that applause. It's really good. Jefferson said that I couldn't easily be bought, and I think that's partially, it's because of the times we live in. 140 years ago in America, I could have been. Yeah, so, as Jefferson said, well, first off, thank you to SAIC for having me here. I really appreciate it. Yeah. As Jefferson said, I am a multidisciplinary artist. I work in performance and photography and installation and screen printing and painting and video. And so, you know, the thing is, well, if you're working in all those media, how do you know a Dred Scott work is a Dred Scott work when you see it, you know? Well, I tell people I make revolutionary art to propel history forward. I don't accept the economic foundation, the social relations, or the governing ideas of America. My work contributes to change by encouraging audiences to explore social questions from this perspective. I sometimes tell people I try and illuminate our era, but then the question is, what is this era? So I've got some questions for you. We're not gonna have a discussion, they're just yes or no questions, so I'm gonna ask a question, and you're gonna shout out yes or no, you know. So, do you have hope for the future? Yes! Okay. Do you think that basic rights in this country are being eroded? Do you think that having 1 in 9 young Black men in prison is acceptable? No. Do you think that a society in which 1 in 5 women are sexually assaulted is acceptable? No. Do you think that leaders in this country or any other country are doing what is necessary to stop the global climate emergency? No. Do you think that American lives are more important than other people's lives? No. Do you think that it's acceptable to supply bombs to drop on children? No! Do you think that fascism is a growing threat in America? Yes! Do you think that the government lies to you? Yes! Do you think that a government that separates children from parents at the border has any legitimacy? No! Does a society where women's lives are dictated to by a religious minority have any legitimacy? No! Does a society where police murder Black people and then violently defend the murder have any legitimacy? No. Do you think that the government values your life? No. Okay, so some of you had hope for the future. The present is not looking so good, right? Okay, So I have hope for the future too, but it is actually hope rooted in people understanding the world the way it is and actively acting to change it. This is a profoundly polarized world where a tiny handful of people controls the great wealth and the knowledge that humanity as a whole produces. But it does not have to be this way. We do not have to live like this. The people can make a completely different world, a world without classes, and where as part of making that world, people can transform themselves. But we need revolution to do that. My work is about helping bring this new world into being. And so that's just the intro. I'm going to show you some pictures now. So this is not my art, but it is the background to understanding a project that I did. There's a project called Slave Rebellion Reenactment, which actually some of Jefferson's work was sort of inspirational to me, and I see Joseph Left Hand out in the audience. He helped do this project, and so it's a project that reenacted the largest rebellion of enslaved people in the history of the United States. This rebellion happened in 1811, and at the time it marched from what is current modern-day La Place, which you can see right up there, where there's a red thing that isn't, it's kind of going away. So, but anyway, from La Place down to what is modern-day Kenner, which is, if you guys have been, come on down. If you've been to New Orleans, it's near the airport. And so we reenacted this rebellion, which had this profound goal and lofty goal of basically the people realized the only way they can get free was by overthrowing the system of enslavement. And so they wanted to seize all of Orleans territory, which is modern-day Louisiana, and set up a new republic, an African republic in the New World. And so this was a project that actually involved lots of conversations. It was a performance that had over 350 people reenacting it. And so for many years, I was going back and forth between New York, where I lived, and New Orleans to talk with the community there. This is the Black Student Union at Tulane University. There were lots of dinners. We had dinners and lunches because, being from outside of New Orleans, I had to actually talk with people about what this history was and also talk with them about how making art about this could matter and get their sort of permission to do it, but also bring them into the process of doing it. We had to look at what enslaved people wore, because a lot of people thought, oh, enslaved people just wore burlap sacks, and we wanted to be historically accurate, and that's not true. So we looked at lithographs and engravings and paintings, particularly from the Francophone Atlantic world, and saw that there were men in turbans, and there were not just burlap sacks. We made costumes. The costume department came up with great designs. This is people, we had sewing circles that people would come. We had a professional seamstress department, and there were seamstresses, but they also taught people to make their own costumes, that people that wanted to, because we wanted to involve as many people as possible. Some people felt they probably couldn't walk the 26 miles it would require to do the reenactment. Other people might have been old, they might have been white, and they couldn't. But this is the man on your right is a man named Sly Watts, who just learned to sew, and he was making his own costume. We had walking practice because we wanted to make sure that us weaklings in the 21st century could walk as far as the ancestors did back in the day. We had to make flags because we knew that the rebels carried flags, but they didn't describe what they were. They're basically quotes from a letter from the general at the time to the governor, General Wade Hampton, and he said there are 500 brigands in the field. They're marching in formation under flags, and so we knew the size of the rebel army. We knew that they were disciplined. It wasn't just people that got pissed off one day from getting whipped one too many times, which would have been righteous, but this was planned for over a year, and they carried flags, but they didn't describe what the flags were. I knew they would not have been the American flag or the French flag, which would have been the societies that people were rebelling against, but we had to make flags. This is an adinkra that's made up, because I'm a visual artist, since there is no historic record, I had to make something up, and this is a Ghanaian adinkra, which means hope and freedom and confidence. There's also flags that are typical in slave revolts that said liberty or death or liberty. This is not misspelled French. This is Louisiana Creole, which would have been the language would have been spoken at the time. And this is a double-headed axe that would have been popular amongst people who were Yoruba, which was an important religion in West Africa at the time. We had sort of practice to look like we were actually a rebel army and not just a ragtag crew of people, and we also had to do other things in that to do de-escalation training, but this was us learning to walk as an army of the enslaved. And this is just a video of people talking about why they might want to participate in this.
Recruiting others into it.
Why would you, a 21st century guy, want to go walk 26 miles in some French colonial clothing?
Because this crazy guy named Dred Scott asked me to do it.
The idea of people
coming together to pool their energy in that way. I feel like we really need that.
This is the closest that I'll ever be able to come to experiencing what my ancestors experienced.
I'm surrounded by comfort. So what happens if I eliminate all that and just the only connection that I have is with the people and the purpose?
It's important for this generation to know that you're not the descendants of slaves, you're descendants of people that were enslaved, and you're at your current position because of the resistance.
To know that your ancestors fought is enough to build up a sense of dignity for a child.
So like if people do know about this history, I think it'll spark rebellion in people today.
People are reevaluating the position of black people in American society in a way that they haven't for about 40 years. And it's not just for black people. This is a question of people who wish to be free from this oppressive society.
Well, I think just in white supremacist culture, there's this idea of disconnecting like myself from the people that came before me that I'm related to. I have to own that narrative. I have to be honest with that, how that's influenced me, what's that granted.
I don't think it's a reenactment. I think this is learning about the material, social, spiritual costs, but also the practice of insurrection.
So this is what you would see if you were in New Orleans on the days of this reenactment. I'm just going to show a few images of what the slave rebellion reenactment looked like. And as you can see in a lot of the background images, there's a lot of the modern in this. Now, when people do reenactment, like the main reenactment tradition in the United States is Civil War reenactment. And a lot of times the reenactors try and take people to like a bucolic field to say, this is exactly how it was in 1863 or something like that. And I didn't want to do that. I'm really interested in how the past sets the stage for the present, but how it exists in the present in new form. And so having this rebel army, the army of the enslaved, coming out of 1811 into our present and rupturing into our present, marching in front of oil refineries, which were put down literally on the graves of enslaved people to actually help people in the present free ourselves. That's what this is about. This is not an accident because I couldn't afford a Hollywood set or be in some field. I actually wanted that clash, that mashup, to be what people are seeing and encountering. You also see people have modern day shoes on or modern day glasses. There are cars that are around, and that's actually the point of the project. I'm a visual artist doing this, not just trying to do a scene from a movie. This was not a project about slavery. This was a project about black joy, about liberation, and about freedom. One of the reenactors after the fact said, I felt like I finally got a chance to represent someone who most people may not even know exists. And that's really important. If people view themselves as the descendants of a broken people, descendants of people that were just slaves, you're going to have one view of both that past, but also how you act in the present. Whereas if you understand that there were over 250 slave rebellions in the United States of over 10 or more people, then you'll see, well, maybe we're the descendants of freedom fighters and actually act differently in the present. People were struggling to be free the second they were enslaved, and people were fighting to get free, and people need to do that in the present. This project got into lots of different news. This is me talking on CNN with Cristin Amanpour. And the work gets brought back into the art gallery world by having these performance stills actually on the walls and the flags be in the vitrines. And so these are large, they're 40 inches by 60 inches. Yeah. So, ashe is a Yoruba word that means the power to make things happen. So this is not my work. These are pictures which you probably are familiar with. These are images of civil rights demonstrators having fire hoses turned on them in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. And so a lot of times we get shown images like this to show how terrible things were back in the past, how terrible, oppressive America was. And often they're said, well, and things are better today. But one of the things, the more I began to look at images like this and images of civil rights demonstrators having dogs sicked on them, was I was not seeing just images of the brutality and oppression of this system. I was seeing the courage of people fighting back. And what were they standing up to? Well, in a certain sense, ostensibly, they were standing up to legalize discrimination, which was the law of the land, literally. But more than that, people might not have had fire hoses turned on them if the worst thing that could happen was they couldn't sit next to a white person in a lunchroom counter. That would have been fucked up, but I don't know that people would have stood up to having dogs bite them just so they could sit down next to somebody white. What undergirded all of this was lynching. Most black people were not lynched, but the threat of lynching could happen to any black person for any reason whatsoever or no reason whatsoever. During the entire history from slavery days, but also in 1865, 1875, 1885, 1895, 1905, 1915, all the way up through the 1960s and in a certain sense to today. But particularly during that era where people were fighting to end Jim Crow segregation, that's what they were fighting against. They were risking their lives to break the back of Jim Crow, including that was undergirded by lynching. So I wanted to show people what these, sort of freedom fighters were actually doing. So a lot of my performance with Slave Rebellion reenactment, it was not about slavery. It was about people fighting against enslavement. There's a great tradition in art of people making work about oppression. And a lot of my work does that. But if you think of, Picasso's Guernica, it shows the horror of a fascist bombing of a civilian population. Or you listen to the Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. Lots of people have done it, but Billie Holiday. It shows the horror of lynching in the United States. And that's really important. There needs to be art that talks about the horrors of now, but there also is a secondary tradition of art engaging how people get free and fight against that. And so this project is called On the Impossibility of Freedom in a Country Founded on Slavery and Genocide. So I hired firemen and had them turn a high-pressure water hose on me as a performance work, and I worked into the high-pressure jet of a water hose as a durational performance for as long as I could. And so earlier I was talking about lynching. This is not my work. This is an image of a flag that the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was founded by W.B. Du Bois and I.W. Wells and others. In the 1920s and 30s, they used to fly this flag outside of their national headquarters in New York the day after anybody was lynched. And again, lynching was not something that happened to every black person, but it could happen to any black person. It was in the North and in the South as well. It's predominantly a Southern thing, but it happened as far north as Minnesota. And so the NAACP had this thing that they called an anti-lynching campaign. And I want you to think for just a second about what it means that you need an anti-lynching campaign. So I thought this was heavy, and I really wanted to honor that history, but I also thought that there was a scourge that is just as vicious as lynching, and that's murder by police. The police actually kill more people than were killed at the height of lynching. They kill about 5 to 7 times as many people each year as were lynched. There were documented about 6,600 racial violence lynchings. The police kill about 1,100 people each year. Now, it's not just black people. Police are equal opportunity murderers, but they do disproportionately kill black people. And so I updated this. This is a man was lynched by police yesterday, and this takes this civil rights symbol and takes it out of an activist space and puts it into an art space, but it's not that the activism is wrong, it's just that that's where this was. I'm an artist. And so and again, some people have said, well, it's a bit harsh to say that the police are the inheritors of lynch mob terror. And it's like, well, make the case for that. Because I actually say, if they're killing people at 5 times the rate as at the height of lynching, and Black and Latino mothers and fathers have to tell their children when they turn 12 years old or 13 years old or 14 years old how to behave so as not to get killed by the police, that's the same terror that Mamie Till faced when she sent her boy Emmett Till from Chicago down to Money, Mississippi, and told him how to behave so that white people didn't kill him. And they killed him anyway. And they made up a story about why they killed him. And it only came out decades later that nothing he did justified that at all. And so this is a sign for these times. My work shifts from gallery spaces into mainstream news media spaces. This is the front page of the NewYorkTimes.com, and then goes back into museum spaces. This is at the Whitney Museum. And so I'm really happy for all the audiences that I have, whether it's an audience that sees it by documentation, whether it's an audience that sees it live on the outside of a gallery, whether it's an audience that sees it in a museum. I value all those audiences. I don't rank one above another. All those spaces are spaces that need art, and I want people to engage. A lot of my work is research-based, and I'm going to start talking about a collaborative project I did with Jenny Polak, who's a really great artist. We wanted to look at how enslavement was not just a US phenomenon, and also how France's role in the slave trade intersected with contemporary migration from Africa to Europe. And so we, in thinking about this, discovered this article from the New York Times in 1860 about a man named Régis who was caught with a boatload of Africans being transported to Martinique. And it was during a time when the transatlantic trade in human beings was illegal. And so France and England were fighting over this. And they had both agreed to outlaw the transatlantic trade in people, but there were some people who just, the deal was too good. They're like, well, why should we stop that? And particularly the French were like, yeah, we're going to keep that up. And so the British intercepted this ship, and they said to Régis, dude, what are you doing? You got like a boatload of Africans, and slavery's outlawed. He said, oh, well, yeah, I know this looks bad, but that's not what you think. These guys are workers, and they've paid for passage on my boats. Well, actually, they haven't really paid for passage on my boat. They're going to pay me back. I've got jobs for them in Martinique, and I've been contracted to bring 30,000 Africans to Martinique by the French, and I'm just taking them there, and they're going to pay me back once I get them there and they do their job. And the British were like, dude, that sounds a lot like slavery. Do any of them go back? And he said, well, no, they don't. So we were like, okay, this is interesting. This is an interesting history to kind of explore. And so we were in southern France, outside of Marseille, and this is Chateau Régis. This is the palace that they built in the 1860s and 70s. It's actually modeled on a previous palace called Chenonceau, which is a Loire Valley palace. And right at the time, the French were had started cutting off the heads of the kings and queens and were moving out of the whole aristocracy. The Régis were like, yeah, man, we got something good going on. We made a lot of money, and they made money in a lot of different ways. Both they ran the slave fort in Dahomey, which is modern-day Benin, that if you wanted to buy human beings in the Francophone world, you would go to Dahomey in this fort called Ouida, and that's where you would buy people. And they kind of had the concession. They got the license to run it. So they made money that way. They also realized the main currency in Africa was cowrie shells, and specifically a money cowrie that grew off the east coast of Africa, but it was used heavily all across Africa, including the west coast. And so most Africans didn't have major ships to haul tons of cowrie shells around the Cape. They were carried by camel caravan across the Sahel. And so it meant that the currency was relatively finite and regulated, but the Europeans, and Régis in particular, said, nah, we can just set up some farms out in the Indian Ocean, we can harvest some, we could take them around, and they basically were counterfeiting money, is really what they were doing, and they destabilized the currency in West Africa. So these were terrible people on all sorts of different levels. But we didn't care about Régis so much as an individual, but we did want to talk about the systems of enslavement and contemporary migration. So we set Chateau Régis on top of a mountain of cowrie shells. And we were thinking a lot about how bodies of water, particularly the Atlantic and Mediterranean, are both places of passage, but also graveyards. And we talked about, there was a myth, a modern day myth, well, it was an old myth that modern day people, folk tales that people told about how basically Africans would disappear and money would come in. And it was basically how Africans were processing capitalism and how it was being imposed on them and what it was doing. So basically, they developed this myth that said that black people would be taken, and then some of them would be, when they were dying, they would be killed and cut up, and their bodies would be tied and thrown overboard, and the cowrie shells would grow on the bodies, and then they would pull up, the Europeans would pull up the bodies, scrape the cowries off, and then repeat the process. Now, it's a myth because the cowries are herbivores. They actually don't grow on flesh. That's not actually what happens. But the mythology was really explaining how black people were disappearing. Whole villages were being stolen, and yet money was coming in. And so we flipped this and said, well, what if there was this cowrie man, a zombie man, coming back to take what's rightfully theirs? Modern-day French people are not exactly happy, or a lot of modern-day French people aren't exactly happy with Napoleon, and this is some young students we were working with in a town in France. And this is just looking at sort of images of planes taking people migrating and images of slave ships. These are all drawings of actual slave ships sort of sinking in France, French slave ships in particular. And on this relationship between the past and the present, these are drawings of some guys from Guinea that we saw in a town called Grenoble, which is sort of a ski resort, and they're food delivery guys. They have this thing that's sort of like Uber Eats, but everybody there has this light blue bag that does it. And so we imagine sort of cane fields on fire with guys with modern-day bicycles just watching it. This is a project that I've done recently. It's from a couple of years ago. It's called Obliterated Power, and there are 3 prints in this series. They're screen prints, and this is Obliterated Power Capitol, Obliterated Power Pentagon, and Obliterated Power Supreme Court. And, you know, these are sort of the 3 pillars and branches of U.S. government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch of government. And it was fun kind of redacting them and erasing them. It's a project called Goddamn. You could figure that out because it says Goddamn there. And it's an homage to Nina Simone. I was interested in several songs that she had written. And one song that, if you know, is Mississippi Goddamn. And this sort of is sort of America Goddamn, and this is 4 Women. And if you don't know that song, you should sort of check it out. If you're fans of Jay-Z, he remixed it. The remix is pretty good, but the original is also pretty badass. Huh? What? Yeah, it is. And sorry, can't hear all that well. Pirate Jenny. And it was actually a song of Bertolt Brecht and Kurt Weill, but the version that Nina Simone does is totally badass. And it imagines sort of this pirate army coming to help this woman who's basically this worker who's shit on by the people who are coming to her bar. And she imagines a pirate army helping to destroy the town. And so maybe the modern day barista is part of rebellions against the police. Who knows? And this is, I wish I knew how it'd feel to be free. And so this is a body print, so it's my size, it's my body, and then with wings and gold leaf and tar and feather. This is burning the US Constitution. It's inspired by, you can clap, it's okay. It's inspired by Ai Weiwei, or responding to Ai Weiwei, a really great, badass Chinese artist. He did this project called Dropping a Han Dynasty Urn. And in talking about that project, one of the things he said, which, and it has a picture of him holding a Han Dynasty urn suspended in midair through the powers of photography, and a Han Dynasty urn smashed on the ground. And one of the ways art is traditionally taught in China was that you study really hard the old masters, and if you get really, really good and really, really lucky, you might be able to make something almost as good as something people made 500 years ago. And he said that was a real constraint on making new things, and you had to be willing to destroy the old in order to make the new. And I think that's really insightful. But the United States doesn't have 500 years of culture, or at least not 500 years of culture of the United States of America. There were people that were here that had 500 years of culture, but not United States Americans. And so, but what is something that's a constraint on people making something new? Well, it's the U.S. Constitution. People prattle on about how there's democracy here and you can do everything and we have freedom of speech and all that other stuff. And it's actually a profound constraint on what people can imagine and think. I don't know most of you. I know some of you. Some of my friends are here, and I'm really happy that you're here, which is great. But, I would say, even those of you that I don't know, if you were writing a document to describe the political and economic structures of a society, you wouldn't, in the third paragraph, write about owning human beings. I doubt you would do that. I doubt you would write a lot of what's in the U.S. Constitution. I mean, frankly, it's a pretty boring document. I mean, it's just, a document laying out you have to be 35 to be president, you got these 3 branches of government, here's how often voting will happen, et cetera, et cetera. It's really boring, but the main thing, though, that it enshrines is private property. That's the main thing that's enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, and part of the property is people. And there are 3 places that it actually talks about owning people, and how it talks about the indigenous, savages is repugnant. It's not what you would write. And so this notion that we have to go back to the founders, I mean, right now we're going through an election, and there's all this talk about we have to save democracy, we have to save democracy. Yes, Trump is a fascist, the Republicans are fascists. But the idea that the people that are committing genocide are actually going to save us, I'm not so certain about that. And more than that, it's a constraint to think that the best we can hope for is going back to what enslavers and friends of enslavers who wrote a document to define the political structure for a society whose economic foundation was enslavement. I don't think that's the best we can hope for. I think that's a constraint on us. So we have the U.S. Constitution, we the people. We have we the people on fire. And we have we the people in ashes. And on that basis, I think we can make something new. This is inspired by the famous photograph of Huey P. Newton, leader of the Black Panther Party in the rattan chair. And I'm not going to say much about this other than take a look. I like it. Moving on. So most of the work I've shown so far is much more recent work. I've shown work, Slave Rebellion reenactment was 2019. I've shown some work that's in 2022, 2023. This is some old work. This is work that I made in the 1980s, early 1980s, when I was a student at this very school. Well, not this school because this is a museum, but in the school that some of you are from right down the road. The punk scene was raging, the punk and hardcore scene was raging, and this was pictures of me and some of my friends, or just my friends, on the dance floor. And I got into art through photography. My dad was a professional photographer before I was born, and during my lifetime, he was a serious amateur. I grew up with cameras around all the time. And that's how I was processing the world. And I had a teacher here named Kim Mosley, who when I first started going here, he said, take a picture of something really radical. And so that's what I did. That was the assignment to the whole class. And so, we were this, subculture that this was during Ronald Reagan's America. Ronald Reagan was monstrous, and either you got along with the narrow-minded selfishness and greed and America first that he was talking about, or you didn't fit in society. I didn't fit in. And so these are my friends, and we were just, I was making work about this. And so at this school, I'm, really glad to be here. And these are some of the teachers that I learned from. I mean, some of them are dead, some of them are just adjunct, so aren't here anymore. But Kim Mosley and Werner Herderick and Joyce Namanis and Barbara Crane were in both photographers and and performance artists that laid a foundation for what I did. I got a really good education from them. Bob Lesher and Victor Sorrell were art historians and really actually changed me, the photographer, into somebody who was thinking about art in a much more broad context, because when I got here, I didn't know much about art. I knew a lot about photography, I didn't know much about art. And the school kicked my ass and made me think about broader things, which was really good. This is a performance that I did actually in the downstairs performance department. I don't know if it's still downstairs in the main building anymore. And they taught me about things like, Marcel Duchamp, the fountain, and so I learned about ready-mades and stuff like that. But there was racism and apartheid that existed in the art world. And I only heard about 2 black artists during most of the time I was here. The only 2 black artists that existed, at least in the 1980s, apparently, it's Romery Bearden and Jacob Lawrence. That was what I was told. That wasn't important. Now I assume you guys all know about David Hammonds and Jefferson Pender and Dred Scott and Carrie Mae Weems and Glenn Ligon. But back in those days, that wasn't taught. And so it was really great when a TA who unfortunately hadn't done a lot of preparation for this class was given a bunch of slides and brings this in, and I'm looking at this and this is really great. And those of you who are art historians know that art historians have to learn German and thinking of a lot, because a lot of art history is written in German. And so this poor young woman starts talking about this piece that says, it's by Faith Ringgold, and it's Die Niger. And I'm looking at this and saying, I think that says Die Nigger. But nonetheless, it actually was really important. I had started to use the American flag in my art by this time. And seeing that was really, really great to see other artists that were doing that and actually had a lot of contempt for America and were tying what they understood about America and what they understood about race and racism together. And so this was really great to see this, and it actually gave me more license to do what I was doing. But this school isn't, and most schools aren't really great about teaching radicalism and revolution. So I had to step outside of the school, even though I learned about Hans Haacke and learned about, Leon Golub, which was really great. Even though I learned about photography and Marcel Duchamp here, I had to step outside of this place to actually encounter the world and encounter other thinkers. So Public Enemy and Toni Morrison and Oscar Brown Jr. were musicians and writers that were really important to me, and Malcolm X and Mao Zedong and Bob Avakian, the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party, were really important for a young revolutionary developing my thinking to help me understand the world and look at the world. I was looking at, this is Chicago, these are the housing projects in Chicago. They've all been torn down. This is Henry Horner Homes. It was a huge project, and you could see these youth that are full of life, but the backdrop is boarded up building after boarded up building. Imagine living here. And so this is the Chicago I was seeing, and that the people I cared about and the people I thought were the base for revolution, and I wanted to make art that represented their interests but also drew them into this process. I also was looking at this. This is a white supremacist demonstration in Chicago in 1985. There's a man standing in full SS uniform with a damn swastika. There's a guy using the American flag as a spear, and there's a guy with a KKK shield. And so this is the world I was encountering and trying to make art about and within. And so I was doing that work. I started doing these installations for audience participation. Hans Haacke had done some of these, but a lot of his work was referencing the art world. And while the art world is important, and I really like Hans Haacke's work, I wasn't so interested in the institutional critique and the battles and conversation about what is the art world. I was more interested in what is the world. And so I was using the American flag in some of this work and doing political statements and asking people to respond. And so in this work, they had a photo montage on the wall, and below that was some sort of political statement or slogan. And then below that was text that said, hey, if you agree with the statement or slogan, feel free to take a print. There was a reproduction of the photo montage on the wall. And then it had book that people could respond in, and I asked people to explain why they were taking a print. And so that was the framework for the work. And then along comes George Bush, a guy who was the former head of the CIA. This is Bush 1, Daddy Bush. And he's running he's running to be president. And, this is on the heels of Reagan. And as I said, Reagan was monstrous. And Bush was, Reagan was somewhat laughable in a certain sense. I mean, he was a mean-spirited, vicious bastard, but he wasn't exactly smart. Bush, on the other hand, was smart and therefore dangerous. Reagan was dangerous too, but Bush was, concentrating something. And, when people are running for president, they often are kissing babies and holding them up and shaking hands and stuff like that. And back in the 80s, people weren't so embracing of the American flag. The Vietnam War had happened, and a lot of soldiers and vets came back and said, "Fuck America." There was a whole anti-war movement. There was a black liberation movement. There was a black power movement. There was a women's liberation movement. There was a gay liberation movement. And a lot of people weren't so big fans of the American flag or America. And Bush identified this as a problem. And he said, actually, I'm going to appear in flag factories as part of my campaign stops, which was really weird. And so on top of that, he was doing that, but he also said, America doesn't have a king or a queen that unites us. What we have is the American flag. I'm like, all right, I got to make some work specifically about this. And so I made What is the Proper Way to Display a U.S. Flag? Okay? And so this work, as Jefferson said, it had a photo montage on the wall, and I'm going to show you detail of that in a second. It had books that people could write responses to the title of the work, and then it had an American flag, 3 by 5 foot, that people had the option of standing on as they engaged with the work. This is the photo montage, and it just has the title of the work. It has an image of South Korean students burning an American flag, holding signs that say, "Yankee, go home, son of bitch." And below that are coffins draped in the American flag coming back from Vietnam. And so this is a work that you could engage by standing next to it, and you could write in the book. Or you can stand on the flag and write your responses. This is a show in Saint-Étienne, France, a couple years ago. And people wrote lots of things. They wrote, whole pages, a whole page. Sometimes they'd write just one sentence, as on the left-hand page. Sometimes, they'd write one very short thing, "on a pole." And, this was shown at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and apparently you guys are artists and you draw stuff, and so people would draw American flag toilet paper. Artists don't really stay within the lines, and so they might cross a couple pages in a dog's mouth. But people wrote a lot of stuff. And so one person wrote, "I'm a German girl. If we Germans would admire our flag as you all do, we would be called Nazis again. I think you do have too much trouble about this flag." You're fucked. Minorities get everything. In Russia, you would be shot, and your family would have to pay for the bullets. But once again, what do you expect from a nigger named Dred Scott? This flag I'm standing on stands for everything oppressive in this system, the murder of the Indians and all the oppressed around the world, including my brother, who was shot by a pig, who kicked over his body to, quote, "make sure the nigger was dead," unquote. The pig was wearing the flag. Thank you, Dred Scott, for this opportunity. So this piece was a bit controversial. This is at the School of the Art Institute in the gallery, and this is people, coming to film the artwork, which is, interesting. The school received bomb threats and death threats there's a lot of history that is really complicated I'm not going to go into the details on, but basically the school shut down for a weekend, so this internationally recognized art school closes to the public for 2 days because of threats. And so I and other people decided we're going to have a press conference. We have to get this exhibit open. It's terrible that the school is caved. And so we had a press conference. This is me standing outside the doors and my first press conference. And then students had a sit-in to get the school open, and the student union actually filed a grievance with the school, said, look, if you're shutting down the show, an exhibition that is closed to the public from the art community, it is assumed that the public exhibition grants student access to the outside community of artists, exercising curators. This is an integral element to the educational process that, if broken, severs the student experience from life after art school. And so the students were demanding that, look, this show is important. We need the public to be part of this so we can be educated. It is part of the educational mission of this school to have this show open. There was lots of press. There was Time, there was The Guardian, there was the New York Times, there was the Tribune, the Sun-Times. There were lawsuits. Judges were challenging the veterans who tried to get this school to forcibly remove the work. The Illinois Senate was actually cutting funds from the school. This is a howling white lynch mob that was in front of the Art Institute, actually right on the steps just outside here. It was almost all white, almost all veterans from World War II and the Korean War. The Vietnam vets weren't there, and they chanted things like, "The flag and the artist, hang them both high." Politicians were at this. There was a named Fast Eddie Verdoliak and Walter Dudich would come around regularly. Since it was a lynch mob, I was on scene, but I was a little above this. This was across the street, and this is a shot for People magazine. I got letters, and sometimes delivered to the school. "Dear nigger," and it ended, "Fuck you, a white veteran." So to them, it was very clearly about race. Traitors should be hanged from the nearest tree or banished to the African jungles. Dred Scott, half-breed Tyler, "You yellow-bellied half-breed coon, you should have your half-breed ass beaten to a pulp." Blah, 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 blah. Jeb Stuart, and Jeb Stuart is the name of the leader of the Confederate States of America. So these people who were seeing this artwork very clearly identified, this is against American racism, and we're racist, so we don't like this. It got to the point where George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush 1, called the work disgraceful. And I'm like, what? The President of the United States knows I exist? And he doesn't like what I'm doing? Well, right on to that. This is a great job. I want to do this for the rest of my life. The Senate voted to ban the flag on floor or ground. The Senate on Thursday voted 97-0 to outlaw displaying the flag of the United States on the floor or ground and denounced a flag exhibit on the floor of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I don't know much about art, but I know desecration when I see it, said Minority Leader Robert J. Dole, Republican of Kansas, in introducing this measure. This disgraceful display needs much more than symbolic action. And so, look, these guys have the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, cops, and more cops, and they're terrified by a previously unknown art student at a Midwestern art school, which is not the center of the universe that I currently live in called New York. It was in Chicago, for God's sake, a cow town. And they're passing a law that in part outlaws my artwork. Now, this was about much more than my art. I'm compressing a lot of complicated history into just this. There was a move to actually make patriotism mandatory or compulsory and have only one permissible view of the flag. But they did actually specifically target my art, as it says right here. And part of it is that was really extraordinary was they were willing to rip up the First Amendment to enshrine only one permissible view of the flag. And it was in part because of an artwork. And so this was actually a really great lesson in the power of art, that these people with all this power would actually be terrified of an art student at an art school exhibition because people might say, what's so great about your country? What's so great about your flag? They might have questions about the foundation and core of this. So, one does what one needs to do if one is confronted by an unjust law. You defy that law. This is me burning flags on the steps of the U.S. Capitol. Now, there were other people that did it with me. There was Joey Johnson, who burned flags or was part of a flag-burning case that went to the Supreme Court the year before. There was another revolutionary artist named Sean Eichmann and a Vietnam veteran named Dave Blaylock. But I was the good-looking one. I got the photo op. And as you could see in these photos, I'm rocking my keffiyeh because I was inspired by the Intifada. I don't need it right now. I'm good. But thank you. It's not the question. So anyway, this is a really powerful defying of this law, which went to the Supreme Court. And it became United States of America versus Sean Eichmann et al. Et al is just a fancy legal word for and others. I was one of the others. And so because of this case and how we fought the political battle, the You guys can do whatever you want with the flag. You can fly it on a pole, you can pin it on yourself, you can make art about it like I have done, or Vito Acconci or Leon Golub. You can blow your nose in the flag, you can wipe your butt with the flag, you can burn the flag. And I encourage you to do some of those things. So, as I said, I'm glad to be here. I would not be the artist that I am without SAIC. But, as you can see, the history is a little complicated. I've spent a bit more time talking about what is the proper way to display a U.S. flag, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. This is in part because of where I am. I think that this audience here might be especially interested in this subject. Understanding this work is as important to understanding my art, but beyond my work, the controversy surrounding it contains some lessons that are important for issues that we're confronting today. On the work itself, the controversy about it helped me truly understand the power of art. In a profoundly divided society, if you make art about important social questions and the art is good, it can really matter. I think a lot of people had to think more deeply about what the U.S. is and what its flag represents. All sorts of people who were typically excluded from the conversation like this had the opportunity to speak through the work. Comments from people whose brother was murdered by the police and their thoughts about the relationship between this and the flag are very heavy. The work gave space for them to think about the relationship between the police and America. And other people reading their comments can too. Through this work, people can see a white lynch mob eagerly waving the flag and read their views clearly stated in the comment books. You can reflect on a cautionary tale from Germans seeing American fervor about the flag. Learning about the power of art through this work laid the foundation for what I've tried to do since. It also strengthened my belief that ordinary people can be interested in contemporary art, including by conceptual artwork, if the content matters to them and the work is accessible. Now, some people have tried to say that this artwork is about the First Amendment. It's not. People have also tried to say that the veterans who wanted to suppress the work and wanted to kill me didn't understand the art. This work is not about the First Amendment. It's a work about America and its flag. The people that were trying to censor the work actually understood it. They just didn't like it. The flag and U.S. patriotism is still a huge question. The Democratic National Convention looked a lot like the Republican National Convention. And Kamala is embracing the flag as much as Bush and Trump. What is the proper way to display a U.S. flag is more relevant and timely than ever. As for the controversy, initially SAIC was on the right side of history. They were reluctantly on the right side of history, but they didn't actually shut the show down and they didn't censor the work. They did many bad things that I hope they are embarrassed by and ashamed of. And I hope they've learned from it too. They coerced teachers who supported me in various ways, including with threats of firing and deportation. They initially closed the gallery to the public and only opened it after 200 students held a sit-in to demand that the show reopen. SAIC did not support me, and the president of the school actually undermined my personal safety. The school received bomb threats, and they knew I received death threats, and they could see the virulent racism on display. Yet the president told me to my face that my safety was not his concern. They didn't close the show, but they didn't close the show. So they did a lot of terrible things, but they didn't close the show, which was important, even though they faced funding cuts and other reprisal. It was really significant that they actually didn't shut the show down. It would have been far worse had they done so. Then the next year, they were on the wrong side of history. At the annual fellowship competition, which I don't know whether they have anymore here, but there was an opportunity for graduating seniors and first or second year graduate students to present our work in the school to the public. It was a big public show, and it was a competition for prizes. So students put their best work on view, and I wanted to include what is the proper way to display a U.S. flag as well as some other works. In response to the initial controversy that happened in 1989, SAIC set up a censorship committee. But to the dismay of the president of the school, the committee decided not to censor my work. So he went to the faculty senate. They wouldn't censor the work either, which was really good. So the president personally censored it. This is a letter from Tony Jones explaining why he censored it. I got a call that my work was taken off the wall and removed from the exhibition and I should come get it. In response, about 30 other students pulled their work from the show, which was the right thing to do. And a commercial gallery came forward and showed our work in an uncensored exhibition. Sadly, SAIC continued down this shameful path for many years, effectively banning me from the school for over a decade. In 2001, Greg Shillette, who was the chair of the Masters of Arts and Arts Administration, attempted to bring a show to SAIC from Wesleyan University. The exhibition was curated by Nina Felshen, and it was a show about police brutality and received critical praise, including 2 substantive articles in the New York Times. Shillette was told he could bring the show, but only if he excluded my work. Fortunately, he refused that offer. Over the years, professors wanted to bring me to speak, and they were told that that would not be allowed. There are a couple lessons here. The first is that doing the right thing and having courage matters. My refusing to back down in the face of censorship and death threats enabled other people to stand up and fight for the work. 3 decades later, it is clear that SAIC and others think that this art is important. Otherwise, I wouldn't be a distinguished alumni speaker. And they're not celebrating their censorship. Beyond the question of individuals fighting for a better world, there's a lesson about institutions, especially art schools and universities. The arts and other intellectual areas of society matter. It's a place where there can actually be ferment and where progressive and radical ideas can find a broader audience. It's why I'm an artist. But this is a society based on oppression and exploitation, and radical ideas are challenged and contested. We're living in a moment where books on American history that mention slavery and racism are banned. In some states, it's illegal to mention gender or talk about gay or trans in school. And recently, students who were standing against Israel committing genocide in Gaza face expulsion, beatings, and jail. Just up the road, Northwestern University journalism professor Stephen Thrasher has been hauled before Congress and is having his career destroyed for preventing the police from harming his students. Closer to home, the Art Institute, where we are right here, called the police on a pro-Palestinian student demonstration. And the cops did what cops do. They brutalized and arrested people. 68 members of this community were arrested, and some needed emergency room treatment. Shame on the Art Institute for doing that. Civil rights demonstrators who demanded an end to legalized discrimination were right, and the racists and cops who beat them were on the wrong side of history. The Vietnam War protesters, including those who occupied university buildings, were right. We don't celebrate the school chancellors and provosts who collaborated with the police. When I was a student in the 1980s, we were inspired by the South Africans fighting to end apartheid. The students who set up shantytowns and encampments and demanded divestment were right to do so, even if it made school officials and some fellow students uncomfortable. There's a battle for the direction of society. Fascism is on the rise, and there's a new McCarthyism. In the face of this, a new generation is fighting for the future in bold ways. Schools should not be doing the bidding of the US government and suppressing dissent, even if standing up to it comes with risks. It's actually pretty simple. Don't call the cops on your students. There are sharp discussions in society now, and artists are a vital part of that. The world is calling out for fundamental change. It's calling out for rebels to defy an outmoded status quo. It's calling out for art to help us engage the complexity and sometimes horror of the world. And it's calling out for art to help us change it. I hope that SAIC can draw on the best part of its history and be a place that helps to nurture rebel artists. And regardless of whatever SAIC does at an institution, I hope that you all join the fight for a radically different and far better world. Now, this would be a great place to end the talk, but I'm not going to do that. I want to show you one more project, and then we'll be done. It'll be quick. So, this is a picture of Venice. It's not my art, but my art appeared there. I was part of the Venice Biennale this year. The Venice Biennial is an every 2-year exhibition, and there are lots of different ways to participate. I had a collateral project called the All-African People's Consulate. It was a real and functioning consulate for an imaginary Pan-African Afrofuturist union of countries. So if you went to this place, you would see the flag and coat of arms on the outside of it. You would see passports on the inside of it. This is somebody getting a passport. It was just a bureaucratic office, and like any office that issues passports and visas, it's an office. This is our consular officers interviewing people who are applying for visas. This is somebody getting their photograph taken so they can have it placed in their passport. This is, some of the work of the office. This is a passport getting created. This is somebody who's really happy to have received their passport. And all passports try and tell the history and sweep of a country that issues it. And so trying to tell the history of a 5,000-year-old continent that is not just one country but a continent was a mission I was doomed to fail at, but nonetheless I produced a pretty cool book about that. In this particular page you see Kwame Nkrumah, who's the founder of Ghana and one of the thinkers of Pan-Africanism. You see an image of Great Zimbabwe, and you see images of the Timbuktu manuscripts, which were manuscripts that talked about a lot of stuff that was in basically a library in Timbuktu that scholars went to for hundreds of years, and people are now defending at great risk because Islamists in that region basically didn't think it contained the right version of Islam, and so they were wanting to destroy that knowledge. And a lot of the knowledge was about astrology or mathematics or science, and a lot of it was about Islam. But and this is an image of Miriam Makeba, the great South African singer, the pyramids of Giza, and a Freedom Tower in Kenya. And this is the app that people would use to apply for a visa, and this is the card that they would get in their visa. And this is somebody really happy to get a visa. Now, the heart of the project wasn't these passports and visas, as cool as they were. It was the engagement with people talking about what it would mean to be part of or to visit this community. The passports were sort of set 8 years into the future, so when you got one, you would get this document that's in some future deck that you'd bring back to the present. And it presupposed the ability to travel freely within Africa. Now, Africans have a lot of trouble traveling, both from Africa to other countries. Africans trying to travel to EU are the most denied visas in the world. But more than that, even within Africa, it's very difficult for them to travel. It's really expensive, and they often get denied. Colonialism has actually made Africans think of Africans the way Europeans think of Africans. And so for a lot of Africans there's a decent African community in Venice. It's small, but it's significant. And for people traveling there, it was really, really meaningful, to a point where people were almost in tears at being welcomed into this community. And just the idea that the scars and division that exists as a colonial creation, we could do away with. Now, I didn't talk about sort of what would have had to have transpired to get there, and the questions of the economy, the social relations, whether it took a revolution or several revolutions. That wasn't brought up, but people just could say, oh, well, this thing now exists. And it also was beyond the continent. There could be countries that are outside of Africa that are part of this. But anybody who was a citizen of one of the 54 countries from Africa or Afro-descendant anywhere in the world was welcome to be part of this community and could receive a passport, and anybody who wanted to visit could get a visa, as long as they weren't like, oh yeah, Africa's really great, they've got cheap labor, I'm gonna set up a factory and exploit the hell out of them. Those people were told you could just stay at home. But anyway, it was this conceptual artwork that enabled people to think about migration, which, Italy in particular is literally causing people to die in the Mediterranean. They're actually violating international law and killing people that are trying to flee, war and oppression and climate disaster. And so this was a very resonant project during the Venice Biennale. And in addition to issuing passports and visas, we had forums. This is a forum called Africa Everywhere, Africans Everywhere. We also had forums on Sudan, there's a great, tremendous oppression and war that's not really a civil war, but it's being fought by two reactionary armies. The people are just dying in tremendous numbers, and it's definitely not talked about enough. And there's some Sudanese exiles who put on that forum, and there were a couple other forums that we had. And so I'm just going to end up with one other project. I told you I was going to show you one project, and I'm going to show you two. I'm going to end up with this one. This is a screen print on canvas. It's about 6.5 feet by 6.5 feet, and it just says, "Imagine a world," and then very faintly, "Without America." It's not actually about geography. It uses geography to talk about certain social questions. And so most of us in the United States are used to seeing a global map with the US in the center. Well, it's world's a sphere. You can unwrap it lots of different ways. And so this puts Europe and Asia and Africa in the center. And it sort of destabilizes that. And it also pushes America out to the sides, which, good thing. But you could see like Alaska on one edge, and you could see South America, and you get Florida and Maine. The Midwest is gone, and Canada. I apologize to any Canadians. It's not that I'm hating on Canada. It's just that you moved your country really close to a really fucked up place. And so you got, cut out. Anyway, but it's not about geography. It's actually calling on people to think about the world, imagine a world they'd actually like to have, and then complicate that thought by imagining that America's not part of the equation. You get a really different world. Even if you like America, which I don't, I look forward to the day it's in the dustbin of history. But you have to admit it has disproportionate influence on the world. It has disproportionate influence. Some of that's good. I've been in South Africa in Khayelitsha and seen people doing wild-style graffiti in the slums of Khayelitsha, one of the poorest, hardest neighborhoods in South Africa. So something that originated in the South Bronx actually was inspiring to people in Khayelitsha. But then there are bombs that have U.S. flags on them that are dropping all over the world right now in Gaza, but also lots of other places. American economy, American politics. It's hard to get an abortion in many places in Africa because the U.S. restricts aid to African countries if they talk about abortion. And so America has tremendous disproportionate influence, but this is really a thought experiment to really imagine the world that you would like and to dream. Right now, a lot of times our dreams are constrained by what we think is possible. And we're worried, can we get maybe one more Democrat into Congress or into the Senate? And that's really narrow thinking. People need to think about what kind of world do we want and what does it take to get there. So I encourage you to do this thought experiment. Imagine a world without America. Now, I'll just briefly say that this is a quote that I heard from Bob Avakian when I was here a student at the School of the Art Institute. And when the battle around what is the proper way to display a U.S. flag was happening, I discovered this quote where he actually posed that question. Now, mostly I'm not taking slogans from people or essays from people and literally turning them into art, but I do think it is really important to talk about the relationship between theory and how that comes back into art. Art is really important, but where your feet are planted in terms of where your people are planted, where your heart is planted, and where your ideas come from really do matter. And so thinking outside of the confines of what America and American imperialism and capitalism is vitally important if we're going to get to a better world. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for a couple questions. Please raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Keep them concise for time allows. Thank you. Elizabeth.
Hello. I just want to say a few things. One, I was a part of your slave rebellion reenactment. Thank you. Two, I was also a part of the SAIC students who were arrested being rounded up. So shout out to them. I really appreciated your whole program here today, this whole lecture. There was a lot in here, so I'm definitely not even going to try to cover everything. My name is Leo, by the way. I'm a member of the RevCom Corps for the Emancipation of Humanity, and this upcoming Sunday, just to speak to a lot of what we're actually speaking to and imagining and actually fighting for and creating a radically different future, where we're going to be getting into this question of the profound fight for the soul of Black people, a defeated people or a revolutionary people. And that's something that needs to be made a mass question throughout this country and honestly throughout society. You know, I was looking at the stills and looking at the heroic struggle of, you know, so many people actually standing up and resisting the oppression and degradation that's forced on people every day. And for right now, right, to actually be able to fight for a radically different future and imagine a radically different future is something that's extremely important for this society, for the culture, because where things are is nowhere good, and where things are headed is definitely toward fascism. And they have the momentum. And, you know, right now, one side's fascist, the other side are mass murderers and mass incarcerators. And the future actually lies in the hands of everyone here. And I actually want to invite everyone here, including yourself, Dred, and everyone, to this discussion at our organizing center at 1857 East 71st Street. That's right in South Shore, to actually be a part of getting into this discussion and this question. That's it. Thank you.
As we say in my Choctaw tribal language, halito, which means hello. So, halito.
Halito.
I'm Reginald Sawyer. For those who do not know me, I'm Mississippi Choctaw, Eastern Band Cherokee Warpaint Clan, and I am the president of the Chicago Two-Spirit Society. Now, yesterday was Indigenous Peoples Day, and yes, I had the proud honor of carrying our Two-Spirit flag in our Indigenous Peoples Day powwow last night with pride, joy, and honor. But my question to you, Dred, is this. Being that we were dealing with the Dakota oil pipeline, and I was so proud to see that a lot of our indigenous people of not only my tribes and a lot of our Two-Spirit people, our gay LGBT Two-Spirit people, come together along with all of our indigenous people in general. But I was proud to see other ethnicities come together to up to North Dakota to fight that pipeline and fight for our rights to have clean water. So I wanted to ask you, did you work with any of our indigenous artists to do any collaborated art with our indigenous artists and even our Two-Spirit indigenous artists in North Dakota to help get the message out against this oil pipeline that was a danger not only to our indigenous people out in North Dakota, but was also a danger to our indigenous people everywhere, and then even here in Chicago?
So thank you for the question. I'm really glad that you were fighting that pipeline. That's really important. It was a major, Standing Rock and No DAPL movement was really, really important for people drawing a line both for climate justice but for the ecology, and it brought a lot of heart to people. But I have not personally worked with indigenous communities in that. I work with indigenous communities around the Slave Rebellion Reenactment Project, but and I'm friends with a couple artists, Jeffrey Gibson, who gave an alumni talk here recently. We're friends, and there's, I was in the Venice Biennale with him and stuff. So I like indigenous art, but no, I was not part of the No DAPL movement. I haven't been, to North Dakota.
And I did see indigenous people in your
Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Laura?
Hello, my name is Kelly Joseph. I'm a first-year grad in the photo department. You're very outspoken about a wide range of issues, so I've been really curious about how have you been able to create a sustainable career while being outspoken about so many different things?
Well, it may have just ended tonight. We'll find out. It's a really good question, and we have like about 4 minutes that I could try and answer a really complicated question. I mean, for me personally, for most of my life after art school, I had day jobs. I'm not independently wealthy. Some artists are, and that's great. If you are, you happen to have money, fantastic. But that's not where I came from, and so I had day jobs. But I was always fighting to try and make art, and always during that time I was getting a grant here, a grant there, and a sale here, and a sale there. And after time, I was able to, honestly be lucky enough to get enough grants and enough sales and enough pay from doing lectures like this that I was able to just, be a full-time artist. Occasionally I teach, but financially teaching has been really terrible for me. It pays really badly, especially at the adjunct level, and I only have an undergraduate degree. So, I didn't want to teach, so I didn't go get a grad degree. And back in the 80s, the reason to get a grad degree was you wanted to teach, and people didn't do it or think I need to get graduate school because I'm going to be a better artist, which sometimes now, there are a lot of really good grad programs, including here, but I didn't do that because I didn't want to teach. I wanted to make art, and so I don't teach much, but it's a fight. And, it is, right now I'm doing okay, but literally next year I might not be, I don't know. It is, particularly during, the uprisings around Black Lives Matter, suddenly there was a lot of interest in my work, and so in a very crass way, dead black kids is good for my bottom line, and that's not anything I do. I've been making this, you've seen 35 years of my work. I've been doing the same thing for a long time, but suddenly my work looks smart to the people who buy and show work. And at a certain point, you turn a bit of a corner, and people, are saying, oh, well, we want you in this show or that show. And then you keep fighting. And I think the challenge is to keep making work that's relevant and not just say, okay, I found a way to sell my work, or I found a way to get grants for my work. I have to keep doing whatever will do that, as opposed to I have to keep making work that's important for humanity. And if I can find a way to, have that be in public venues and prominent places, and people want to continue to support and fund it, that's great. But it's a battle. I'm not Ai Weiwei. I'm not, Jeff Koons. Weiwei's art I like a lot and really respect. Jeff Koons I don't like all that much, but those artists, or Mickalene Thomas, she's a great artist. Jeffrey Gibson, great art. They sell a lot of work. Their careers, at least for the short term, are set for a long time. I have to fight for sales and exhibitions and grants, but I'm lucky. Many artists would trade places with me in a heartbeat, and I realize it's a tremendous privilege to be able to do what I do, to get up in the morning and make art, or be flown into Chicago and talk before a full house. It's really great, but it's the real question is, it is a question for art students, how to do this. And there's no simple answer. There really is not a simple answer, but the question is, the real profound question is, how do you make work that matters? And then as you're doing that, how do you get that connected to an audience, and can that support itself? And I think right now, it's possible. There are a lot more artists that are doing really kick-ass stuff, including artists that have come through this school, that are doing really great work. But, that could get shut down and tossed out. Right now, the battle over the direction of society, in Italy, I was just in Italy, won the Rome Prize, fascists are literally in power there, and the art and culture is becoming, Tolkien, and leaving aside what you think of Tolkien, he's not a visual artist, but that's what's showing in the Contemporary and Modern Art Museum. And so that's the challenge. Having people like Toni Morrison's book banned and artists like that, it's entirely possible that depending on how things go, if we don't win a better society soon, my work, I'm not going to be allowed to come and talk to people like y'all. I'm not going to be able to show the work. But, I'm going to keep fighting. I'm not going to give up. But so, that's, we could talk more, but there's no simple answer. I told you what I do, but it's going to be a fight, because this is a society that's dominated by capitalism, and capitalism doesn't have use for the kind of work that I do and that I hope you do. But art is a place where you can fight and carve out some freedom and hopefully reach an audience with ideas and aesthetic and joy, and find a way to continue to elevate it on a higher level so it can reach the people it needs to reach. And maybe in that context, you might be able to pay your rent. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dred. Thank you, everybody.